Can you take a quick glance at the sky and tell what the time is without checking your phone or wristwatch? I guess not. However, in the medieval era, people had to rely on the sun's position throughout the day to determine the time. And no, they don't have to be a sorcerer to get it right accurately. From sunrise to sunset, people's lives revolved around the passage of time. Not the kind of time you could check on your wrist or phone. No, this was a world where time was felt, guessed, and sometimes even prayed for. Whether you were a peasant harvesting wheat, a monk preparing for prayer, or a nobleman planning a feast, knowing when to act was just as important as what to do. But how could they know? Today, we are revealing the secret behind medieval genius methods of telling time and how they executed their daily routine from morning to night. Medieval people had no digital cues, no pocket watches, no buzzing reminders. So, they improvised. And in that improvisation, the first timekeeping tools emerged, a clever instrument born out of necessity. One of the earliest was the sundial, a device that used shadows to chase the hours. It was simple, yet to the medieval mind, it was nothing short of magical, a stick casting a shadow that could tell you when to pray or gather. It felt divine, like time itself was whispering through the sun. But what's even more fascinating is how medieval people thought about time back then. It wasn't a countdown. Time was a rhythm, a spiritual order, something granted by the heavens, not controlled by humans. But that perception wouldn't last forever. And what came next? It changed everything. The establishment of time is to create urgency, because it became an issue when medieval people couldn't fix a specific task to a particular time, like we do in modern times. That's the daily puzzle medieval people had to solve. Before mechanical clocks existed, time wasn't something you could track precisely. It was something you had to interpret. Sure, the sun rose and set, the seasons shifted, and bells rang in distant monasteries. However, without a tool to indicate precisely when it was in midday or just before dusk, people had to live in a constant state of approximation and uncertainty. And the consequences? They were serious. Monks could miss sacred prayer hours. Farmers might lose critical harvesting moments. A knight could arrive late to a battlefield gathering, putting an entire campaign at risk. Even kings and nobles, people at the very top of the social ladder, weren't immune to the confusion. Time in medieval society was universal. It didn't care whether you were born in a castle or a cottage. You needed to rise, labor, rest, and repeat, just like everyone else. But how could anyone coordinate anything without a shared system? This was a world without standardization. One town might use church bells, another might follow the rhythm of a nearby river. Inaccuracy wasn't just inconvenient, it was detrimental to their growth. There was also no real urgency. Without a countdown, people lacked the pressure we feel today when a clock ticks closer to a deadline. Meetings, agreements, and tasks were often vague in timing, when the sun is high or just after the morning prayer. That vagueness made coordination across towns, regions, or armies almost impossible, and yet the need to tell time was growing. The growing tension between what society needed and the tools available sparked innovation. It pushed people to think beyond tradition. If they couldn't control time, perhaps they could at least measure it more accurately. And so, one by one, new instruments began to emerge, not from mere wishing, but from monks, merchants, and inventors. Some looked to the sun, others turned to water, sand, or shadow. Each new idea was an answer to the same old question: how do we make time obey us? What came next wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. The medieval world needed answers, and those answers came in the form of invention. Let's start with the sundial, arguably the earliest structured attempt to read time from nature. At its core, a sundial was a flat plate with hour lines and a vertical rod or triangular blade called a gnomon. As the sun moved across the sky, the gnomon cast a shadow onto the plate, marking the hour. It seems simple now, but to the medieval mind, it was a brilliant idea. Sundials worked by translating celestial motion into something visible and measurable. They turned the sky into a giant clock face. Monasteries embraced them early on. Monks needed to pray at fixed intervals: matins, lauds, terce, sext, and so on. Before bells or chimes, sundials kept the rhythm of sacred life. Public sundials were also placed in market squares, providing common folk with a shared reference point for their daily routines. But there was a flaw. No sun meant no time. Cloudy days, indoor settings, or nighttime hours rendered sundials completely useless. That's where the hourglass entered the picture. Hourglasses, or sand glasses, began appearing in the early to mid-medieval period. Their precise origin is debated. However, by the 14th century, they had become common across ships, churches, and scholarly institutions. An hourglass contained two glass bulbs connected by a narrow neck. Sand trickled from one bulb to the other at a consistent rate. Once all the sand had run out, you flipped it over and started again. What made hourglasses revolutionary wasn't just their simplicity, it was their portability and predictability. Unlike sundials, hourglasses didn't care about the weather. You could use them indoors, at sea, or on cloudy winter mornings. That's why medieval sailors especially loved them. At sea, sundials were useless, but an hourglass worked in storms or on a moonless night. Ships often used multiple hourglasses to time watches, shifts, and speed estimations. Time became not just a matter of ritual but of navigation and survival. Merchants and scientists used them for experiments, lectures, and daily scheduling. Hourglasses also introduced a psychological shift. Visible time loss, watching sand slip away created a sense of urgency, something sundials didn't offer. This sense of countdown began changing how people related to time itself. It was no longer divine, it was something slipping through your fingers. Still, hourglasses had their limits. The sand's flow rate could be affected by humidity, glass imperfections, or poor craftsmanship. You needed a new solution, something that worked with precision and even in darkness. Enter the water clock, also known as a clepsydra. Water clocks had actually existed for centuries before the medieval period, used by ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, and Greeks. However, medieval Islamic scholars, particularly in places like Baghdad and Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, refined and adapted them to meet new cultural needs. And slowly, Europe took notice. A water clock measured time by regulating the flow of liquid into or out of a container. Some designs had a small hole at the bottom of a bowl. As water escaped, the water level dropped past hourly marks. Others filled up gradually and rang bells when full. These devices were often beautifully crafted, decorated with zodiac signs, astronomical motifs, and ornate gears. In the medieval Muslim world, they weren't just tools, they were art. Islamic engineers, such as Al-Jazari, even created elaborate water clocks with automata, mechanical figurines that moved at timed intervals. In Christian Europe, simpler versions of the water clock became useful in cathedrals and monasteries. Unlike sundials, they worked at night. Unlike hourglasses, they didn't require flipping. Unlike both, they could be scaled up to ring bells and mark time for entire communities. Each of these inventions, sundial, hourglass, water clock, reflected a different attitude toward time. Sundials were about alignment with nature. Hourglasses were about personal discipline. Water clocks were about mechanical precision and automation. Together, they demonstrated the medieval mind's evolution. From viewing time as a divine rhythm to seeing it as something measurable, even controllable. But each solution also had its drawbacks. Sundials were weather-dependent. Hourglasses lacked accuracy over long periods. Water clocks were fragile, required maintenance, and were difficult to scale outside of large institutions. Still, something bigger was brewing. These inventions weren't just gadgets. They were stepping stones. The growing frustration with their limitations and the increasing complexity of medieval life, encompassing trade, war, labor, and prayer, demanded something more reliable, something mechanical, and just when society seemed to hit its limit, it happened. A spark of innovation would emerge from the cathedrals and towers of Europe, one that wouldn't just tell time, but change it. Time is the soul of this machine, Giovanni da Dondi, 14th century clockmaker and designer of one of the earliest known astronomical mechanical clocks. Those words weren't metaphorical. To Giovanni and his peers, the mechanical clock wasn't just a device, it was a living concept, one that would fundamentally reshape how medieval society functioned. It introduced something the world had never truly seen before, a reliable, independent measure of time down to the very minute. Before mechanical clocks, people relied on the natural flow of the sun, sand, or water. But now time ticked forward with the cold precision of gears, escapements, and iron hands. No sunlight, no manual flipping, no guesswork. And in one particular historical moment, this newfound precision quite literally saved a city. Let's go to Milan, 1335. The city was under heavy strain, facing internal political strife, external threats from rival territories, and crumbling discipline within its military ranks. Meetings between city officials and guardsmen lacked coordination. Ambushes were mistimed, defense schedules collapsed due to a lack of synchronization. Then came the turning point. The Visconti rulers commissioned the installation of one of the first tower-based mechanical clocks in the city's central bell tower. Its purpose? To create a standardized public time that everyone in Milan, merchant, monk, or militia, could reference. The mechanical clock didn't just chime the hours, it rang consistently, with tones audible throughout the city. It became the metronome of civic life. Guard shifts tightened, council meetings began promptly. Even market regulation became possible, with merchants required to open and close by the tower's chimes. One observer wrote that Milan went from a city divided by shadows to a city bound by iron time. That single change transformed its defense coordination during a siege later that year. Reinforcements arrived exactly on the hour, archers rotated by the bell, and the enemy, expecting Milan's usual delays, was thrown off by the city's newfound precision. The siege broke, not just by sword, but by synchronization. This was the power of the mechanical clock. It didn't just tell time, it regulated society. However, the effects extended beyond warfare and markets. The invention introduced something previously foreign to the human experience: seconds, minutes, and measurable hours. Before mechanical clocks, an hour was elastic. It stretched or shrank depending on the sun's movement, but the gears didn't stretch. They ticked, uniformly, consistently, and that changed everything. People began to experience time as divisible, not as a flow, but as units. Suddenly a monk could ask, "How many minutes left until prayer?" A craftsman could schedule jobs not by morning or afternoon, but by the hour. And as this mindset spread, it led to something even more radical: wage by the hour. Laborers were no longer just working until sunset. They worked for 8 hours with 10 hours and 15 minutes of break time. The mechanical clock transformed time from a natural rhythm into a commodity. You could sell your time, you could waste it, you could save it. Entire economic systems began to rely on this principle. Cities built clock towers not just for beauty, but for economic control. The bell became the heartbeat of the marketplace, the rhythm of the factory, and the conductor of the cathedral. And then came the psychological shift. Time was no longer seen as a divine mystery. It became a disciplinarian. You could be late. You could miss your moment. Time became something that demanded obedience. People began organizing their day down to the minute. Monks structured their lives around fixed canonical hours. Merchants calculated travel schedules with pinpoint accuracy. Even personal life began to reflect this obsession. A quarter past, half past, just before noon. These phrases didn't exist a century earlier. Now, they were shaping people's entire sense of urgency and responsibility. The awareness of seconds, tiny fleeting fragments, led to a rising anxiety about duration. Tasks were now judged not just by quality but by efficiency. The medieval mind, once content with eventually, now faced a ticking world that demanded exactly when. This pressure gave rise to a new kind of person and a new position of the timekeeper. In many towns, a designated clockwinder or keeper was assigned to maintain the gear mechanisms, reset the weights, and ensure the bells rang at the correct intervals. These individuals held immense local power. They were the guardians of order. In courts, royal advisors began to carry portable clocks, precursors to the pocket watch. Kings used them to time meetings, armies used them to coordinate attacks, and universities began structuring classes around timed lectures. And at the center of it all, the mechanical clock, looming above the town, chiming with mechanical certainty, commanding attention, order, and awe. Did you know that Salisbury Cathedral in England was home to one of the oldest working mechanical clocks in the world, installed around 1386? It had no face, no minute hand, just a mechanism and a bell. But that bell rang with such regularity that it became the town's timekeeper for centuries. People would gather in the cathedral square, listen for the bell, and set their rhythms in response. It was the first time in history that machines told us what to do, and we listened. Even art and literature began to reflect this shift. Time was no longer just a passive backdrop, it became a character, an antagonist. Paintings began to feature clocks, poems mourned lost hours. Writers like Chaucer referenced the clock's chime as part of daily life. And yet, for all its genius, the mechanical clock also introduced a burden. People now live by the hour. Deadlines appeared, expectations tightened, the lazy morning vanished, and slowly time transformed from a gift into a taskmaster. Still, the gift it gave, awareness, structure, coordination, progress, laid the foundation for everything to come. Without it, there would be no industrial age, no shift work, no standard time zones, no global coordination. The clock didn't just change the Middle Ages, it transformed them. Because when you can measure time, you can master it. And when you master time, you master the future. From shadows on stone to the ticking of iron gears. Medieval timekeeping wasn't just about tracking the hours, it was about reshaping an entire way of life. Each instrument, from sundials to hourglasses to mechanical clocks, told more than time. They told a story of innovation, discipline, and the growing human desire to bring order to chaos. And in the process, time stopped being something you felt and became something you followed. If this journey through medieval timekeeping fascinated you, make sure to check out our other deep dives into forgotten inventions and strange stories from the past. Drop a comment below. What timekeeping tools surprised you most? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next video might just change how you see history, 1 second at a time.